Thanks for showing up, everybody. We're really excited to have you here today. My name is Cecilia Gavinsky. I'm the collections manager here at the Western Heritage Center. I did want to remind everyone to please turn off their phones if you haven't already. And also, I want to invite you after the lecture to please make sure that you check out, if you have time, 2 brand new exhibits that opened last month. We have Equally Different, Discovering the History of Disabilities over here on this gallery. And then downstairs we have Viva la Fiesta, which is in the community gallery. So if you have any questions about those exhibits, feel free to ask me. I'm really excited to have Crystal here today. She's a friend of the museum, so we're very honored that you drove here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cecilia.
I'm really excited for this program. We're all in for a treat. So I'm going to read you guys her impressive bio here, and then Crystal will get started. Crystal Alegria.
Good job. You did it.
Is the executive director of the Extreme History Project, a nonprofit based in Bozeman, Montana. Crystal has worked in the field of public history for over the past 20 years at a variety of museums and heritage organizations, always with the goal of bringing history to the public and highlighting the stories of those that have been marginalized. She produces the Dirt on the Past podcast with co-host Nancy Mahoney and has recently co-produced a documentary series, The Story of Us, The Women Who Shaped Montana, that premiered on Montana PBS in 2022, episode 1, and 2024, episode 2. Crystal has a bachelor's in anthropology and a master's in history, both from Montana State University. She grew up in Livingston, but now lives in Bozeman, Montana. We also would like to give a special thanks to our sponsors, Michelle and Conrad Karen, for supporting this lecture. All right, let's give Crystal a nice welcome.
Thank you, Cecilia. Well, thank you so much to the Western Heritage Center, and thank you to Lauren and Cecilia for inviting me here today. I'm so glad to be talking with you about cemeteries this afternoon, one of my very, very favorite things. So how many of you in this room love cemeteries? Okay, good. I figured that's maybe why you were here. But cemeteries are wonderful places to learn history and to enjoy so much else, so many other things in addition to history. It's a great place to see the flora and fauna, to see the environment. It's such a good place to see sculpture and art. It's such a good place to have some alone time to ponder your own thoughts. So cemeteries bring us so many things. And I as well love to stroll through a historic cemetery, enjoying all those things, the flowers, the plants. Often animals reside in cemeteries, so it's always so fun to wander through the cemetery. And there's a name for us, you know, people who love cemeteries. We are called taphophiles. So let me see if I can move this forward. I might need someone to show me how to move it forward. Cecilia? I did too. Oh, maybe I can figure it out. Nope. Is it the green? No, okay. All right. Oh, we have an official clicker there. This is not the official clicker. That's okay. If you just want to move it forward once, Cecilia, and then I'll keep going while you get that. So if you can move it forward one more, that'd be great. So taphos, so a taphophile is someone who loves graves. So the next time someone, you know, talks to you about cemeteries, you can say, well, I'm an official taphophile. I love cemeteries too. So why are cemeteries important? In addition to what I just talked about with the beauty of cemeteries, why do you think cemeteries are important? Any thoughts? Okay, so they remind us of those who have gone before, those who have departed. Yes. Why else are they important? A lot of history, yes. Yeah, so I call cemeteries outdoor museums. Oops. Outdoor museums, and they really reflect those ideas of a community. So they really reflect the place in a way that the community wants that place reflected. So you'll see a lot of community values when you go to a cemetery. And all cemeteries are different. And that is because they are community driven. They're driven by the people that are buried there and the family of the people that are buried there. So they really do reflect those communities. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. And they do have, like you said, a lot of history within them. So this is a picture of me in Salem, Massachusetts, so not here in Montana, but actually on the East Coast. And their headstones on the East Coast are a little bit different today. We're going to be focusing mainly on Western cemeteries, but I just wanted to point out that everywhere you go, there is a little bit of a difference on what cemeteries look like. And so when you go to, how many of you been to a cemetery on the East Coast? So quite a few of you, yes. Those headstones are slate and they're skinny and they're totally different, but they're just as beautiful in a lot of different ways. And I could talk about those headstones for a long time, but I won't. I'm going to get more into pioneer cemeteries that we see here in Montana. But before I do that, I'm going to go way back in time. I'm going to go back in time to the first burials here in Montana and talk a little bit about that burial, the oldest burial that we have here in the state of now what we call Montana. Of course, when this little boy was buried 12,500 years ago, this was not called Montana. It was, who knows what the people called it. But that is how long ago we have evidence for people being here in what we now call Montana as 12,500 years ago. And it is because a burial over by Wilsall was found, a burial of a little boy who was about 2 years old, was found in the 1960s. A couple of men were digging fill dirt in this embankment. They had a backhoe and they were digging for fill dirt. And as they were digging into this bank, they noticed some red soil and they thought, oh, that's kind of odd. And so they went to investigate, and within that red soil, there was a large number of artifacts, over 100 artifacts. And then all over those artifacts was red ochre, kind of sprinkled all over those artifacts. And then within the artifacts were remains of a person. And so they could recognize that this was very, very significant. And so they called in a local archaeologist, Larry Laren, and he also agreed it was very significant, and so they contacted the Smithsonian, and it kind of went from there. But this burial, this child burial, is known to us now as the Anzac child, or the Anzac site, because in the 1960s, the Anzac family owned that land. They actually still own that land. And like I said, this is just right outside of Wilsall, Montana. So we have a very significant archaeological site, burial site here in Montana that not a lot of people know about, so it is important to talk about it. And they dated the little boy's bones to, and the artifacts to 12,500 years ago. And they've also done DNA on the little boy's remains. And that has been some very significant research that's been happening more recently. But a few years ago, they did rebury that little boy somewhere in this area, so he is reburied. So it's an important burial site. And we don't know, of course, what that little boy, people called themselves. But of course, people have been burying their loved ones here in Montana ever since that time. We're going to jump ahead in time, though, and that is a picture of some of the artifacts that were found with that little boy. If you would like to see the artifacts, they are held, not all of them, but the majority of them are held at the Montana Historical Society in Helena, and that museum is currently closed, but they're going to be opening later this year. So I highly encourage you to, if you're ever in Helena, stop by and see these artifacts, because they're amazing. They're beautiful spear points. Some of those blanks over here, oops, I don't know if I have a pointer, let's see. Well, do I have a pointer, Cecilia, maybe? Nope, oh, that was the wrong thing to do. Anyway, the ones on the far right are actually about this big. So these are blanks that they would carry around, they would stash in different places, and when they needed to make a tool, they would get out that blank and kind of winnow it down. And so this is basically a toolkit for this little boy to use in the afterlife. And so you'll see there's spear points, there's elk antler tools, all those sorts of things. So it's an amazing collection, and you can actually see some of the real artifacts at the Montana Historical Society. Okay, but like I said, we're going to focus in more on more recent history. So we're going to talk about some pioneer cemeteries here in Montana and some of the symbolism that you see in pioneer cemeteries. And so let's start off by talking about what is a symbol. So can I ask you guys another question? What is a symbol?
To represent something?
Yeah, it's something that represents something else. Yeah, exactly. So we use symbols, we wear symbols, we live our life by symbols, don't we? I mean, if you look around this room, if we look on our clothing, you can see a lot of symbolism. So some of these symbols, I'm going to give you some examples, and some symbols you're going to recognize and some you may not, but I'm going to start with a really easy one. So what is that a symbol of?
Peace.
Peace, right. So most of the time when I do this presentation, people recognize that symbol very easily. Okay, what is this symbol?
Power.
Say it again.
Power.
Yes, power, on, off. Yep, exactly. So if you, probably every computer, a lot of different things that we utilize nowadays has this symbol. Okay, what is that one? Starbucks. Right, exactly. So as soon as you see that, you would probably recognize what that is, huh? What about this one?
Prince.
Yeah, very good. So so this is the symbol for Prince. So Prince the artist. So for a time during his career, he didn't want to go by the name Prince. He wanted to go by the symbol, which represents love. And so he went by this symbol for part of his career, which was really hard to talk about him because he didn't want you to say Prince, he wanted you to use the symbol. And of course this all came from a dispute he had with his record company. But but anyway, he went back to using the title Prince, and we were all, whew, good, because that was easier. Okay, so let's see, I think that might be it. One more. Okay, who recognizes what this symbol is?
Deathly Hallows.
Deathly Hallows, okay, yeah. So where does the Deathly Hallows come from?
The Harry Potter.
Yes, the Harry Potter series. So you can tell that some of you in this room maybe didn't know immediately that that was the symbol for the Deathly Hallows from the Harry Potter book series. And so you can tell that some symbols that are very prominent in our culture, not all of us recognize, do we? We recognize, some of us of my age group probably recognize the Prince symbol, but maybe not have easily as recognized the Deathly Hallows symbol. So, and you know, symbols change over time too. So this, you know, 10, 15 years ago was called what? The number sign, you know, something like that. Of course, yep. And so now we call this, most likely, if anyone today sees this symbol, they would call it what? The hashtag. Yeah, so this symbol has changed over time. And so we have to remember that when we're thinking about symbolism. And a symbol we see today and think of as the hashtag, you know, people 20 years ago would have looked at this and no one in the room would have said hashtag. So things do change, symbols do change, ideas do change about symbolism. And so we have to remember that when we're looking at symbols on headstones as well. Okay, so let's start talking a little bit about headstone symbolism. And I'm going to start with some symbolism that I think is one of the most prominent symbolism that we have in headstones on headstones in cemeteries, and that is flowers. And a lot of the headstones, the time period we're going to be talking about, a lot of these headstones were created in the late 19th, early 20th century, which we call the Victorian period. And at that time, Flowers were very, very important to the Victorian people, and flowers had a real strong history of symbolism, and people living in Victorian time period knew exactly what each flower meant and what it symbolized, so much more than we probably do today. So flowers were a real way to communicate different things to different people during that time. So we have a lot of symbolism, different symbolism, plant and flower symbolism up here. I'll start with wheat right there on the left. You'll see that stalk of wheat that is on the top of the headstone, and this is usually where the wheat stalk is found. But this talks about living to a ripe old age, this idea of wheat, and that you lived a good life. You're going to reap your harvest in that time of resurrection. And so most of the symbols also that I'm going to be talking about today have a Christian baseline or have a Christian ideology basis, because a lot of the people who buried themselves in these cemeteries that we have had a Christian belief system. So a lot of these things will kind of harken back to the Bible and that Christianity. So the calla lily, which is right there in the middle. That's a beautiful flower. The calla lily is also something you see in cemeteries quite a bit, and that symbolized purity, and it really symbolized that idea of purity within marriage. And so, of course, calla lilies are beautiful white lily, purification. And so oftentimes you'll see these on headstones of a married couple or someone who is married within that headstone symbolism. There's also Easter lilies that you'll see on headstones quite often. There's the lily of the valley, which is down on the right-hand side. And the lily of the valley represents Mother Mary and Mary's tears when she cried for Jesus during his crucifixion. So lily of the valley is prominent. And we in Bozeman don't have a lot of lily of the valley in our cemetery, but a lot of other Montana cemeteries do. So like I said, every cemetery is different. And you may find, a lot of calla lilies in your cemetery, or you may only find one or two. You may find a lot of lily of the valleys, you might not. The laurel wreath, which is on the one on the far top right, the laurel leaf, or the laurel wreath, is always kind of found at the top of the headstone again. And that really symbolizes that idea of victory over death. So, of course, the laurel wreath to us still today symbolizes victory. And so victory of living a good life and going to heaven and having resurrection and death. The ivy, which you see down there at the bottom, ivy is very prominent on headstones, and ivy often represents the Holy Trinity because it is has 3 leaves to it, and then it also represents friendship. And ivy is an evergreen, so it represents that idea of friends who will never leave you, especially during loss. And it also represents friendship because when you experience grief and loss, the friends will cling to you and hold you up. And that's what an ivy plant does, is it clings to things. It clings to whatever it's growing up. So I love the ivy. Whenever I see an ivy on a headstone, I always love to see that. So flowers are very prominent. Now, when you go to the cemetery, again, you'll probably notice flowers you never noticed before. And that's the same thing with the next type of symbolism I'm going to show you. Whoops, before I show you that though, I want to talk a little bit about flowers at funerals. So because there's flowers on headstones, we think there's a direct link because there was always flowers at funerals. Because before we had embalming, it was really important to have something with a good, strong, nice scent next to a bedside. And oftentimes there were flowers like the Easter lily next to a funeral in the funeral parlors or in the living room where the person was laid out, because they had a scent that would overpower the scent of death that was probably starting to happen with these folks. And so you'll see a lot of these flowers, and that's probably a natural crossover to having flowers on the headstones. So, and this is a great photograph from Miles City, and so I've never really seen something like this, so I thought I'd pop that in there, by the photographer Robert Morrison. He's a great photographer. So now we're going to talk about hands on headstones. And so hands are also well represented on headstones. And you know, the reason I think they are is because hands are really important to us, aren't they? We use our hands every day for everything. And so hands are significant. And so why wouldn't they be on headstones? And so you'll see that there's a lot of different ways that they use hands on headstones. So you'll see on the left here, the clasping of two hands, and that has a couple different meanings. One meaning is that husband and wife are going to be holding hands forever in eternity. The second meaning is that God is taking the hand of the person who is deceased and taking them up to heaven. So I love both of those ideas. And also, this goes a little bit further with some hands. So we have a lot of Masonic symbolism in cemeteries on headstones. And so you'll sometimes see the clasped hands, and if the gentleman was a Mason, he'll have one finger pointing out. And so that's sometimes how you can tell if the person was a Mason or not. Do I have an example of that? Yep, right up there with Jake Oakwood. You can see that they're clasping hands and one finger is kind of pointing out, and that means that Jake Oakwood was a Mason. So that's kind of interesting. So watch for that next time you're in a cemetery. You'll also see the hand with the heart in it. And sometimes this represents that the person was part of the International Order of Oddfellows, which was a fraternal organization. But sometimes it will also symbolize that the person was very charitable in their heart. They were very charitable to others. And so you'll see the hand in the heart. And this one is one of my favorite headstones in the Bozeman Cemetery. It's just beautiful with the beautiful heart in the hand. So there's a lot of different hand symbolism. There's also the finger with the crown. And the crown, of course, symbolizes Christ, also known as the King of Kings. That's why we have the crown. And the finger pointing up through the crown indicates that the deceased has gone to heaven through the power of Christ's resurrection. And sometimes you'll see the finger pointing up without the crown. And of course, that also then means that the person went up to heaven. Sometimes you'll see the finger pointing down. What do you think that means? It's not what you're thinking. It just means that the hand of God is coming down to grab the person and bring them up to heaven. So, okay, yeah. So, all's well. So this next symbolism is really interesting to me, and we see a lot of this in Montana. And this is the gates ajar is what this symbol is called. And you can see it's very well named. It's basically the pearly gates of heaven, and they are open just ajar. And so this symbolism comes from a book written by a woman whose name was Elizabeth Stewart Phelps, and you can see a copy of the book on the right-hand side there. And this book was written by Elizabeth Stewart Phelps in 1868. So what had happened in our history, in our nation's history, just prior to 1868? The Civil War, right, had raged from 1861 to 1865. And of course, a lot of young men of all ages died in the Civil War. So there was a lot of grief and sorrow in our nation at that time. And Elizabeth Stewart Phelps had been afflicted with some of that grief and sorrow. She did lose loved ones in the Civil War as well. So she wrote this book that follows a young woman who's grieving the loss of her brother who died in the Civil War. This is a novel. She finds solace from her aunt, who tells her that the gates of heaven are not closed, but always remain open ajar. That way, souls can pass back and forth between heaven and earth. And in this way, loved ones who have passed are always able to observe friends and family who are among the living. So this was really a symbol of solace for a lot of people, this idea of the gates ajar, and this book took off. It was the Harry Potter of the 1860s. You know, it was a best-selling novel because, of course, what were people looking for after the Civil War? They were looking for solace, and this novel kind of probably mirrored some of their experiences. So this became a very popular novel that then just kind of motivated people to put symbolism within this idea, and the gates ajar symbolism started showing up on headstones. It showed up in different other things as well, things that were sold, but definitely was imprinted on headstones. And people still use this gates ajar idea on headstones today. I don't know if they know the basis of it. But here in Montana and in the West, we have a lot of gates ajar symbolism. Okay. Now these are probably some of my favorites. Who has seen a tree stone in a cemetery? Okay, yeah, tree stones are great. And they're all different as well. Oftentimes there's different things. We have 5 tree stones in the Bozeman Cemetery, and all 5 of them are very different. And so if you go from tree stone to tree stone in your cemetery, they'll probably all have different things on them. So you have to look, and you have to kind of figure out all the different symbols that are on these tree stones. These were really popular from the 1890s to the 1910s, and they were part of that Victorian rustic movement. And you can see that kind of with them. They're often associated with the Woodmen of the World or the Woodmen of America, which was a fraternal organization that was very popular during that time. But if you were just someone and wanted a tree stone, you were more than welcome to buy one yourself, even if you weren't associated with a fraternal organization. So some people that had tree stones were not part of the Woodmen of the World or the Elks or the Moose or some of these other fraternal organizations. But you could order these from a catalog, and you could pick what you wanted on the tree stone. So this particular one, you can see that it was Montana Woodmen of America. So this person was associated with that fraternal organization, and the axe was one of their symbols. And so the axe was part of that fraternal symbolism as well. But there's always kind of that scroll panel on the front that has the person's information. And then there's always usually branches coming out, and some people say that those branches represent how many children the person had. Some of the tree stones are very large, some are very small. You can also see that there's some calla lilies at the foot of this tree stone, so you can see a carved calla lily down there. Let me move to my next slide, and I'll show you some more. So the one in the middle, there are ferns at the bottom of that tree stone, and they symbolize humility. That's what ferns symbolize. There's also, you can't really see it on this photograph, but on the tree stone in the middle, on the right, is this little owl. And so, of course, owls symbolize wisdom. And sometimes you'll see the head of a stag or an elk on these tree stones if they were a member of the Elks fraternity. So they're fun to look at, and they're fun to really see the different kind of tree stones, see all the different symbols that are represented. The one in the middle also has that branch that's kind of broken, and that represents that the person didn't live a really long life, but his life was cut short. And so you'll see that oftentimes. And of course, the tree stone stump itself was an oak tree that represents strength. And you'll see some oak leaves represented on these trees sometimes. So they're beautiful tree stones. Do you have a lot of tree stones in the cemeteries here in Billings? 2. So not a huge amount. Yeah, they're wonderful. Okay, and then this is a symbol that you see a lot on headstones a little bit later in time, more from the 1910s time period, and this is called an inverted torch. And so, of course, a torch upright is someone living their full life. They're full of life and energy, and their flame is burning bright. But when the torch is upside down, inverted, the flame has gone out. But there's always a little flicker left. And so you'll see that this one in the middle and the one on the right-hand side, the flame is upside down and pretty much extinguished, but there's a little flicker kind of still going upwards. And so that represents that idea that the person is dead, but their soul lives on and will live on forever. So I like that symbol as well. Now, there's a lot of drapery because, of course, think about the time period, again, that we're talking about. We're talking about the Victorian era. And the Victorians loved stuff. They loved things. Their houses, if you see pictures, are just jam-packed with all sorts of different knickknacks and dishes and flowers and lots of drapery, lots of curtains, velvet drapery, those sorts of things. And so you see that represented on headstones as well. So we see a lot of crossover from houses, what people had in their house, to what then they would put on their headstone, or how they would decorate their headstone, the place in the area around their headstone. So sometimes you'll see little fences around a headstone, and that really symbolizes the idea of the white picket fence that people had around their houses. And so the drapery is one of those crossovers as well. So the drape kind of represents that draping between life and death. And it's that veil or that distinction between life and death. The soul passing into the afterlife through the barrier of the veil. And drapery expressed mourning during the Victorian era as heavy black fabric. This heavy black fabric would be draped throughout the homes of those in mourning and over the caskets as well, and then symbolized on the headstones. And you've often probably heard that phrase, "it's curtains for you." So that really means the end, or the end is coming, or death is coming. A death of some kind is coming. And this really draws that theatrical image of the curtain closing at the end of the show. So drapery is important, and often it has some cool tassels too. So this is a beautiful headstone with some Masonic symbolism at the top that we're going to talk about here soon. Here's another headstone with some drapery on it that also has an urn at the top, and you'll see urns on the top of a lot of these headstones from the 19th and, well, going back very far in history, urns have always been connected with death. And of course, that's, an urn is where you place cremated remains. Now, none of these headstones in our pioneer cemeteries have cremated remains in the urns, but the symbolism is very powerful, so they would put that urn at the top to portray that idea of the death. It's that ashes to ashes symbolism. Okay, now I'm going to get to, the anchor. The anchor, this kind of goes back to what I said at the beginning, that symbols aren't always the same. So, you know, the idea, the meanings of symbols change over time. And so what would you think if you saw an anchor on a headstone? What comes to mind immediately for you? Navy, sea, water, you know, those sorts of things. But this really goes back to that idea and symbolizing that idea of hope. And so that's what this is symbolizing during this time, is that idea of hope. And so, and this really comes back to that Christian tradition again. Hope is one of the three theological virtues, including charity, hope, and faith. And hoping for the divine union in heaven and happiness in resurrection. Okay, now fraternal symbolism. This is the best. I could talk about this for hours. And this is where you see some of the most amazing symbols in cemeteries, is with fraternal orders, because they have some great symbolism. And so I'm just going to kind of briefly talk about some of the symbolism that we see up here in these headstones. But I really, encourage you to go out and look at some of these symbols on headstones. And I'm just barely touching the surface here. I mean, like I said, I could talk for hours about the different symbolism that fraternal organizations have. And when I say fraternal organizations, that means organizations like the Masons or the Masonic Order, the International Order of the Odd Fellows, and you probably have all heard of these organizations. And for us, they're not as prominent as they once were in that 19th and early 20th century. At that time, especially in places in the West, fraternal organizations were really important because people were moving out here from the East, they were moving out here from other places, Europe, all over the world. They were coming here to the Western United States, and they didn't really know a lot of people in these towns like Billings that were being built. And so having a network system that you could kind of just tap into, like the Masons, was really, really significant and important to make a living and to make a successful living in these pioneer frontier towns. And so a lot of these people belong to not just one fraternal organization, but sometimes 2 or 3 fraternal organizations. Another important aspect of belonging to a fraternal organization is that oftentimes the organization would buy a plot of the cemetery where then the people that belong to that organization could be buried for free. In the beginning, they would bury you for free, and so that was kind of a death benefit of these organizations. That got pretty expensive, so after a while they didn't do that any longer. But in the beginning, they would bury you and put a headstone up for free, and of course they're going to put their symbol on it, aren't they? It's kind of like putting their brand on it, because they use their funds to bury you. And so we have some symbols. Probably the most common symbol that you've seen is the Masonic symbol, which is down on the right corner, and that is the compass in the square with the G in the middle. And I've talked to a few Masons about that, and they say that the G in the middle represents God and or geometry. So, and any Masons in the room? Okay, we have a couple, or one. So he nodded his head yes, so good. But there's a lot more symbolism within the Masonic lodges, different levels that you can attain, that then that symbol would be on the headstone. Another really prominent symbol that we see in Montana cemeteries is the Odd Fellows, International Order of the Odd Fellows over here on the left. And that is the 3-link chain. And so you see that chain that has the 3 links, that is the symbol for the Odd Fellows. And any Odd Fellows in the room? No? No? Okay.
We have an Odd Fellows cemetery.
You do, yes, yes. So oftentimes, like I said, the Masons, the Odd Fellows, some of these other organizations would buy a whole section of the cemetery. And sometimes they have their standalone own cemeteries, yeah. And so, so the Odd Fellows was very prominent in Montana, but now not as prominent as the Masons. The Masons are still prominent here in Montana, but not as much the Odd Fellows. Let's see, let me get to my notes here. The Odd Fellows had the 3 links symbolize friendship, truth, and love. So those are what the 3 links mean. And then there's also, so if you were a Mason or an Odd Fellow, you had to be male to belong to those organizations. But they did also have auxiliary organizations that women could join. So the Odd Fellows auxiliary organization is Daughters of Rebecca. And so you see the Daughters of Rebecca for the Odd Fellows right next to it, and I just love their symbol. It's the crescent moon with the dove, and then the R that symbolizes that idea of the Daughters of Rebecca. And the crescent moon has 7 stars, which represents the order of the universe of God and nature, and the value of regularity in all worthy undertakings. So, and of course the dove symbolizes peace. So I really think that one is a beautiful symbol. The one next to it is the Knights of Pythias, again, a fraternal organization that we don't hear much about anymore. In fact, it's almost defunct. But the Knights of Pythias has a really interesting symbol, and it is a knight, of course, but they also sometimes have a skull and crossbones. So if you see a skull and crossbones in our cemeteries out here in the West, most likely that person was associated with the Knights of Pythias. You see a lot of skull and crossbones in the East, on headstones in the East, but those really represented the idea of memento mori, or everyone will die. They were very harsh in their ideas about death. It's coming, so be careful, live your life well because you will soon be dead. Here, it was a little more soft than that. But here we don't have a lot of that memento mori symbolism, but we do have a skull and crossbones that represents the Knights of Pythias. Okay, let's see what we've got next here. So white bronze. Have you seen one of these? Do you have much white bronze in the Billings cemeteries? Quite a bit, yes. Now this was very, very popular for a time. If you look at the headstones that I've been showing you, they are very solid, granite, marble, all these stones that weigh a lot and cost a lot to ship. White bronze is not that, and white bronze is basically zinc, and so it's an iron, zinc. Not iron, but a zinc. And so the Monumental Bronze Company started in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and they operated from 1873 till about 1913. And these headstones became very popular here in the West because they were a lot lighter and easier and less expensive to ship out to the West. And so they became popular, and you could really interchange a lot of different symbols on these headstones. So there was a catalog, much like for the tree stones. These zinc or white bronze headstones had a catalog you could choose from. And so look at all those cool symbols you could put on your headstone. And so you'll notice that these they had little plates that you could screw in, screw out, put different things on. And so not one of these is usually the same either. They're very much like tree stones in that respect. And so these are always fun to look at and see all the different symbolism that is attached. And of course that really reflects the person that is buried there. So you can learn a lot about the person based on what's on their headstone. So these kind of fell out of fashion, like I said, mainly because in World War I, all, iron materials, steel, everything was used for World War I. So after that, they just never really kept going, and they fell out of fashion. But they say that the funny thing I like about these is that they say that during Prohibition here in the West, people would stash their liquor inside of these headstones. So if they needed a little nip before they went to bed, they go out to the cemetery and grab their bottle and have a drink and then put it back in and screw up the screws and head home. So I love that idea. And so a lot of times these are broken and you can kind of peer into them. So I'm always looking in to see if I see a bottle in the base of the headstone. I haven't found one yet, but that's just the story they tell. Okay. Now, cemeteries have a lot of history, and they have a lot of beauty, and they have a lot of beautiful landscaping, animals, all the things I've talked about before, but they are places of grief, and they're places of sorrow. And so, as a historian, when I go in the cemetery, I'm often looking more for the history. But then you come across a headstone like this, and you remember, these places are very hard for people to go into and to spend time in sometimes because your loved ones are in these places. And so when I see headstones especially a headstone like this, I remember that. And this was a particular type of headstone that was called the tufted armchair stone. And this was really a popular motif here in Montana. And there was a monument carver that lived in Butte and Helena, kind of went back and forth between the two places, this was his type of stone that he liked to carve. And his name was Prescott, A.K. Prescott. And you'll see his advertisements for his monuments in the historical newspapers. And this was kind of one of his specialty stones. So you'll see a lot of this tufted armchair throughout Montana, Colorado, Wyoming, kind of in the west. And it wasn't just Prescott who was doing this. There was a lot of other monument carvers who were doing this style as well. But Prescott was really good at it. And this one is from the Mount Moriah Cemetery in Butte. And it's a really good example. Of course, these were all carved out of marble, and marble is not as hard of a stone as granite, for example. And so a lot of times these tufted armchair monuments kind of look like they're melting away, but this one is in really good shape. So you'll see these are a little bit different. Each one is a little bit different as well. But the main part of these tufted armchairs is, of course, the little armchair. And then draped over the armchair are socks and shoes, and sometimes a coat, like you see here, and a hat. And it symbolizes that idea that this little boy or little girl came in from playing, and they took off their coat and their hat and their socks and the shoes, and then they got sick and died, and they'll never put those socks and shoes back on again. So it's a very sad symbol. But it is fun to look at these because they're often different. Sometimes it'll have a baseball cap if it's a little boy. And this one has a sun hat for a little girl. Sometimes they'll be very, very, just the socks and shoes. Sometimes they'll be very elaborate. So they're always fun to spot in the cemetery. And I think the Mount Moriah Cemetery has 2 or 3 of these, but this is the one that's in the best shape. Another one that is like the tufted chair is what we call the socks and shoes monument. And this, like the tufted chair, was pretty popular during the late 1900s, the late 1800s, early 1900s here in Montana. And this one is similar in that it has the stone with the child's name on it, but then the shoes are on the top and the socks kind of are spilling off the stone. And so this one is in the Bozeman Cemetery, but we have 2 of these in the Bozeman Cemetery, but you can find them all over Montana in different cemeteries. And this one was for a little boy who died in Bozeman. He was 5 years old, and his father was the editor of the Bozeman Chronicle at that time when he died. And his father was actually not in Bozeman when this little boy got sick and died, but he was back east. And he had gone back east for a trip, and he caught pneumonia and was very, very sick in New York when little Jamie here in Montana got sick and died. And so the father of Jamie didn't even know that his son had died until he got back to Bozeman after recovering from his own illness that he almost died from. And so the mother of little Jamie kind of had to take care of all the funeral arrangements. She had to take care of her son as he was dying in his death, and then knowing that her husband could possibly be dying in New York. So it's a rough, rough situation. So, okay, I'm gonna stop there for a minute. So as I kind of come to the end, I want you to think a little bit about what all the symbolism that I've shown you over the last few minutes here symbolizes about this community of Montana. And I've shown you symbolism of the environment. We see plants in the form of wheat and flowers on our headstones. So we can kind of we can start to understand that the environment is important to us people who are living in the 19th, 20th century Montana. We have also seen symbols that represent Christianity, but there are other belief systems that are represented in our Montana cemeteries. We see a lot of cemeteries with symbols that represent Montana's Jewish community. We have Hebrew writing on a lot of headstones throughout Montana. So I don't want you to think all symbolism is Christian. It is not, but what I've showed you here today is. So we know that there's belief systems that are important to people living here at this time. There's arts and culture with the gates ajar. That idea of literature is important to people. There's also fraternal organizations, so that idea of networking and having people who are like-minded is important. And then there's also that connection of everyone who is experiencing cemeteries at that time is grieving. So there's that idea of grief that is represented always in cemeteries with the drapery, with the gates ajar, with the socks and shoes, with the tufted chair. All those symbols really represent that overwhelming idea of grief. So I just want to have you think about how these cemeteries really can reflect a community. And as you go into a cemetery, next time you go into a cemetery, look around and see if you can figure out what that community is trying to tell you about who they are, who they were, and what values they held as important, because you can always see those in a cemetery. So that's your homework, is to go into a cemetery and look for that. Your other homework is to think about, what would you like on your headstone? Because of course we are all going to die, memento mori. What would you like on your headstone? What values are important to you? And think a little bit about that. Now, I go into a lot of cemeteries, and I think about this a lot. And like I said, every cemetery is different. So a few summers ago, I was back in Wisconsin, where my grandmother and grandfather were from, and I have a lot of family in Wisconsin. And I was wandering around the cemetery, and I really looked at the more modern headstones. And modern headstones have a ton of symbolism on them, because now we have laser etching, and you could put anything on a headstone. And so my family, I'm descended from the Bowers and the Bruners in Wisconsin, in the dairy land of Wisconsin. And so this is a distant relative, but this is the Bruner headstone. And I thought this really sums up, I can look at this, and I never knew these people, but I can really see what they valued in their lives. So they had probably a dairy farm in Wisconsin. They had, you can see their barns over there on the right, and you can also see their outbuildings. You can see deer over on the left. Maybe the guy or the woman was a deer hunter or a hunter. You can see the rows of probably a crop, which was most likely corn from this part of Wisconsin. And you can see a tractor there in the foreground, and then you can see the setting sun, and you can see the beauty that is Wisconsin with the rolling hills and the lush trees. And you can really see what these people valued: the wedding ring in the middle, and the names of the people, their children's names on the headstone as well. So even in modern sections of the cemetery, you can see so much symbolism. So I encourage you, like I said, to go out into a cemetery sometime soon and think about the lives and deaths of the people who lived in the place that now we call home. And while you're out there, enjoy the beauty, enjoy the art, and enjoy the outdoor museums that are cemeteries. So thank you all so much for coming today. And I'll take questions if you guys have any questions, or thoughts or comments as well.
I have a comment.
Yeah.
I appreciate you doing this before Memorial Weekend, because I'm from the Roaring Moor Lewistown area. So now I can look at the gravestones and look at the symbolism.
Yes. Yes, we're kind of coming into that time when we will be spending more time in cemeteries. For Memorial Day. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Have you ever been to Arlington?
I have not been to Arlington Cemetery.
I just want to tickle
Yeah.
my mother wanted to bury my father.
Yeah.
He was a Marine Corps colonel, but he was also cremated. And I've never understood it, but Arlington would not take cremations.
They do now.
You should look into it. Yeah.
And our veteran cemetery here also.
Right. I didn't know.
Yeah.
This has been in the 90s, early 90s when you
A
have.
lot of things have changed in veteran cemeteries.
Yeah. Yeah. Look into it. Yes. Wonderful.
What about founding fathers, in particular, say for instance, the Colson Cemetery? Have you poked around up there?
I haven't. I haven't.
Yeah, cool and great to go look at.
Yeah, I know. There's, what I find is the smaller cemeteries are always so interesting and have so much history. And I love the gates over the front of the cemeteries as you go in. A lot of the more, the larger cemeteries, they've made it more accessible for cars, and a lot of those gates have gone away. But those smaller cemeteries are really unique in that they still have some of those original gates and the archways over the front of the cemetery, which are wonderful. I went to the Warm Springs Cemetery. I was doing research on someone who died at Warm Springs, and we were hoping that they were buried in one of the Warm Springs cemeteries. We were trying to figure out where this person was buried. And so a friend and I went to see if we could locate the person in the cemetery. And so we went to the main building of the Warm Springs area, and Warm Springs started out as a sanitarium, or a place where people would go to if they had an affliction of some kind, but then it kind of transitioned to a state mental hospital. And so this person, we think, had been there when it was a sanatorium. But we went to the main place and we talked to the people, and they said, well, the cemeteries are in the back of Warm Springs. So you just drive back along this road and you'll find it. And so it was kind of at the end of the day. It was starting to get a little dark. It was starting to, it was in the winter. It was at dusk, and we're like, okay, we'll go search for the cemetery. And so we started back there, and this person wasn't kidding. It was kind of way at the back of the property, and you go through this little winding dirt road all the way to the back. And it started to get like foggy as we went back there. And we get to this gate of the cemetery, and it's this old arch with this wrought iron, and the fog is coming in. And I looked at my friend Marcia and I said, this kind of feels like this we're in kind of a horror movie or something. I said, we do not, whatever we do, we cannot separate, because then that would be the end of us. And so we go into the cemetery, and unfortunately at Warm Springs they didn't have a lot of the names on the headstones. So we looked and we looked and we looked, and we never found the headstone. But I always will remember going into that cemetery, because it was quite an experience. So,
It's the opposite. Any place that is blessed, the ground has been blessed as many times as people have been buried.
yes.
It is a sanctuary.
Right. Yes, exactly. And once we got into the cemetery, I felt that way. I felt like we were fine. It was just that initial driving up to it. We just kind of looked at each other like, what are we getting ourselves into here? And, like a lot of people think about cemeteries being haunted. And, I do walking tours in our local cemetery. Terry, you guys have come on a cemetery tour with me. And I have never seen anything resembling a ghost in a cemetery. A lot of people do, but I never do. And I always think, well, why would they be hanging around here? This wasn't where they lived. This really didn't mean as much to them as like their house would, or their, some other place that would mean so much more to them. So I never get scared when I go in cemeteries, except that one time I was a little scared. Yes.
I live near the Sunset Cemetery. The people that lived in my house before, the children called it the Dead People's Park.
I love that. And it is. They're like parks, Yeah.
First parks were cemeteries.
Right. And they're coming back around to be that again. My daughter lives in Los Angeles. She just moved there a few months ago, and she lives right next to the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. I mean, like right next, when she told me where she got her apartment and I Google Earthed it, and I'm like, Emily, you're right next to Forever Hollywood. I was so excited, but now I look at all the events they do at Hollywood Forever to tell Emily about it. And so they do movie nights there, they do yoga in the cemetery, they do a Dia de los Muertos celebration, a Day of the Dead celebration that's phenomenal there. So they're becoming more not recreation, but more places to go and experience things like that, which is wonderful, kind of coming back around to that. Okay, well, yes.
So you mentioned you do cemetery tours. I can't remember, are you Billings or you're?
I'm sorry, I'm from Bozeman. Yeah, I live in Bozeman. We do cemetery tours, but you guys, the Western Heritage Center does amazing cemetery tours too. Yeah.
In September and October.
If you check our website, you can, here we have the schedule for our walking tours here.
Yeah.
And they're on our website.
And then you guys do a really special thing. Do you want to talk about that, Cecilia?
Yes, we do, in September, October, I can't remember the date.
The 13th and the 20th, I think.
13th and 20th of September. We do an event called Voices of the Past. And so we research some of the people that are buried there, and then we have actors portray them who tell their stories. And we try to do a really broad range of, we have Hazel Humphrey Talanan, we have J.G. Link, so we had Ollie Lauren, the brothel madam. So it's a really fun event, and we're very respectful, and it's a nice time to get out and learn and be outside, and it's kind of different and fun. So make sure to join us for that.
Yeah. So, yes, and if you're ever coming through Bozeman, check out Extreme History Project. That is the organization I work with, and we do a lot of historic walking tours as well, and we do one on Sundays at 4 o'clock through our beautiful historic Sunset Hills Cemetery. I know that Butte does cemetery tours as well, and any other towns that you all know of that do cemetery tours, Helena is starting to do some cemetery tours now as well, so a lot more towns are starting to do tours through their cemeteries, which is a great way, like we said at the beginning, to learn history. So, Anaconda, yeah, Anaconda cemeteries are out of this world. And Butte too, yeah, they're amazing. All right, well, thanks so much, everybody. One more question, comment, thought.
I never thought I was interested in headstones until I went to New Orleans. And they have a lot of angels that how the angel is positioned means stuff. You know that?
Yeah, so
do we have any angels around here?
we do. If you go into the Catholic sections of the cemeteries, you'll see more angels. So a lot of times cemeteries have sections, Catholic sections, Protestant sections, like we said, the fraternal orders, Odd Fellows, Masonic, but in the Catholic sections, you'll see more angels. And so angels are, and cherubs, and those sorts of symbolism is more prominent in some of those parts of the cemeteries. And then places that are much more Catholic, like when I go to the Butte Cemetery, I see a lot more angel symbolism than I do in other parts of Montana. So I think that you'll see them in some cemeteries. You won't see an angel anywhere in some other cemeteries. So it's really interesting. And so I don't know the positioning of the angel. Has anyone heard about that? I haven't. I'll have to look into that a little bit. For different positions, symbolizing different things.
One of the things that I remember from the tour is two hands up, men died in war.
Oh, okay.
And so, but most of them had one across the heart, one just up. And that's when oh my God, I just thought the carver, only one arm.
It all means something.
I did not ever realize that it all meant.
Yeah. And all statuary has deep symbolism. You know, so a carver would never carve anything just willy-nilly. They always had a reason. So it's fascinating. It's fascinating.
And do you think people said, like a parent would say, I want this on my, because now I think of, the only time I've been familiar with headstones is when we're picking one out for someone who's passed. In the family, they never knew what their headstone was going to say or read. But was that more common to pick out your own headstone?
No, it was often the family that would pick out the headstone. And sometimes a headstone wouldn't be put up for many years because they were expensive, as they are today, they're expensive. And so a family would save up. So a lot of times the death or birth dates on headstones are wrong. And you know, again and again, I've seen that. I've gone through primary documents and seen seen that the date on the headstone is wrong. And I think that's because people put up the headstone many years after, and sometimes maybe it wasn't a direct relative, but you know, the daughter or the granddaughter or someone, and so that date had been lost. That's my theory anyway. But yeah, so it wasn't often the person picking it out for themselves, but it was their family members or their friends. And so they would put on the symbolism that they thought, and oftentimes they would pick that symbolism from a catalog or something, or tell the carver. Probably that didn't happen all the time, but a lot of times it did. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Well, thanks so much. That was wonderful. Good questions, and have a great rest of your day.